All right, in the female reproductive tract, we're going to primarily focus in on the ovaries, though we'll talk about the uterus as well, right? Because the ovaries are where we're actually producing our oocytes. The ovary produces or releases, it's still an immature egg called an oocyte. It'll become an ovum. The ovary is also the female reproductive organ that's producing the hormones, so estrogens, again, that's a whole class of hormones, the primary one being estradiol, right? But the estrogens and also the progestins, which progesterone is the main hormone there. And then we're also going to see the ovaries producing inhibin, just like the testes did, in order to act as a feedback mechanism on kind of continued endocrine stimulation of the ovaries. We'll talk a little bit about the uterus. The uterus is, of course, the organ that's actually in charge of housing and nourishing the developing baby. And so that's going to be an important organ as well. We won't have time to get hugely into the developmental processes that take place, again, during the development of that fetus. A lot of that's in chapter 29. Read it before you return your book. Okay, so in the female reproductive tract, see if I can get this. There we go. Right, it's going to be this ovary that's producing, again, these immature oocytes. So we looked a lot at the anatomy in lab this past week. I thought this was a really nice image out of your textbook. I'm in the way. It's figure 2812. To show both the broad ligament, which I know some of us were trying to figure out, right? It's almost like a mesentery, kind of anchoring the uterus and the uterine tubes in place. And then I also really liked this image because some of us were talking about, okay, where is the fundus? And so here, looking from the anterior view, it's a little bit easier to kind of see that area above where the uterine tubes enter the uterus. So anyway, most of that we covered in lab. I did want to point out, because I know I talked to a few of you about it, that the ovary and the fallopian tube aren't actually attached, right? There is space between here. The fimbriae are trying to pull eggs into the uterine tube or the fallopian tube, but it's not like any egg that leaves the ovary is automatically in that tube. So I did want to point out that to folks who maybe I wasn't talking about that way in lab. Okay, so one of the most important processes that's taking place here in the ovary is oogenesis. So this is the production of eggs. Now, what I really like about this image, again, out of your textbook, look at that too, in one chapter that I liked, is that it shows both what's going on as far as the development of the egg and also what's going on as far as the development of the follicle, because those two are happening at the same time, but they're not in lockstep. And so it can be kind of hard to follow. So let's talk about oogenesis first, and then we'll come back and look at the follicle. So oogenesis begins before birth, right? This is something, a lot of this takes place fetally. It accelerates at puberty, and of course then is going to end at menopause. We're going to start out here with a stem cell. This parallels what happens in males, right? We start out with a stem cell called an oogonium, or plural here is oogonia. And again, this stem cell is undergoing mitotic division. It's doing mitosis, right? So one cell divides in half, right? Each has 46 chromosomes. One of the oogonium remains, right? And it stays as a stem cell to do that division again. And then the other daughter cell from that division goes on to become a primary oocyte, who is destined to move towards becoming an ovum, right? But all of this mitosis is done before birth. In fact, what we end up have happening is this primary oocyte is actually going to start mitosis, right, before birth. The division begins, and then it hits pause. And this is kind of interesting. So this is actually in prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and it's just going to hit pause, and it is going to stay there until puberty arrives, at which point some of these might complete meiosis, go on to become a secondary oocyte, maybe even eventually an ovum, and then quite a few of them are going to undergo atresia. They're going to get recycled, right? They're not going to go on and mature. So what we see happening here, right, is it's not until puberty, right, that we're actually going to see any progression here. So in meiosis, so you have this primary oocyte just hanging out, and right before ovulation, that first meiotic division is completed, right? And this is when we would then have a secondary oocyte, right? We've separated those homologous chromosomes. Half of them have gone into the secondary oocyte. Notice now you only have 23 chromosomes. It is haploid. And I mentioned this in the first video here. The other half of that genetic material becomes what's called a polar body. So we don't give that during cytokinesis, when we pinch the cells apart, we don't give that side the organelles, the cytoplasm, the nutrients, right? And so that is also going to kind of get recycled. It's not going to be used. We're putting all our time and energy into this secondary oocyte. Okay? The secondary oocyte is the form, again, it's immature, but this is the form that's released from the ovary at ovulation. Okay. The secondary oocyte is only going to complete meiosis II if fertilization takes place. How crazy is that? It's not until the sperm actually breaks into the boundary, right? That first sperm actually fuses with the cell membrane. That's going to create a whole wave of different effects, and one of those is that it triggers meiosis II. So they're showing you here, again, meiosis II, we're going to keep all the cytoplasm, organelles, nutrients, everything with one of those daughter cells. That's going to be the ovum. And then the other half of the DNA goes into a polar body, right? And that's going to basically just get recycled. So there's so many similarities, right? You'll notice spermatogonium, oogonium, right? Primary spermatocyte, primary oocyte. Like the language is really parallel, and they're both doing mitosis and then meiosis. Really the big difference here is in sperm production, right? You're trying to get as many sperm as possible. All those daughter cells, that's weird, right, to call sperm daughter cells, but all those daughter cells, there's haploid, we need lots of them. They need to be small, they need to swim, like all these sorts of things. On the female side of things, right, notice the male is just delivering, the sperm is just delivering DNA. The female, the ovum, needs to provide everything else. And that's why we kept concentrating all of the organelles and the cytoplasm and everything into one cell, so that when fertilization takes place, it's primed and ready to go for mitosis, this rapid cellular division to take place. One other thing that's super interesting in the follicle is that oocyte is developing, as that follicle is developing and we're getting ready to release it. The surrounding cells are like packing the oocyte, right? It's like handing it like a little lunchbox, right? Packing it full of all sorts of nutrients that it's going to need to support the development of a new embryo. So kind of a neat way that the female reproductive system is slightly different, right? Much more focused on the care and feeding of that offspring, where the male reproductive system really is focused on delivering DNA. Okay, so then the follicle development, I do want to mention this as well. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about the cycle of the female reproductive tract. This is another thing that's really interesting, right? Is that basically every 28 days, we're going to see a series of cyclic changes in hormones, and changes that are going to affect the ovary as far as follicle development, and then those hormones are also going to affect the uterus and the lining there. So what you'll see that we keep talking about, right, is that in that 28 days, I need a whiteboard. In those 28 days, right, you start at menses, the first day of menstruation. Typically at about day 14, that's when ovulation is going to take place. And so that time in between there is referred to as the follicular phase, because what we're seeing right here is the follicle has to develop, right? and be released. Okay. Following ovulation, we're going to see the development of a corpus luteum. This is actually going to be an endocrine structure. This is the follicle that has kind of exploded. And the second half, so from ovulation till day 28, is going to be referred to as the luteal phase. So we have a follicular phase, really where this follicle is developing. After ovulation, we enter what's called the luteal phase. So you'll see that, and we'll go over that a few times here. So what's going on in the follicle, right, is that before birth, that primary oocyte, the one who's stuck in meiosis 1, is hanging out in what we call a primordial follicle. So that primordial follicle is really that primary oocyte and like just a thin layer of follicle cells around that. What we're going to see then is, right now we're entering into puberty and we're seeing what happens here is basically each month a group of these follicles is going to be triggered by hormones to start developing, start supporting the development of that oocyte, and so these follicles are going to grow. So a primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle. It's still a primary oocyte inside. Right? That tends to confuse people that we're changing phases or changing stages of our follicles, and the oocyte is just kind of hanging out there. Okay, but this primary follicle still houses a primary oocyte. But what you see happening, right, is these cells, so the granulosa cells that make up this follicle are starting to grow and divide. And so you have, did I show this? Yeah. Granulosa cells, and then we'll get into thecal cells down here a little bit, but basically granulosa cells and thecal cells, these are both making up the follicle, and they're going to work together to help start producing this glycoprotein rich, what's called the zona pellucida. So the zona pellucida we see here surrounding, this is way too small. It's this little like clear area right around the oocyte. This is what's nourishing the oocyte, right? We basically need to keep handing it nutrients, oxygen, etc. These granulosa cells and thecal cells also are going to be producing estrogens, right? So what we'll see is during this follicular phase, as the follicle is growing and those cells are growing, we're going to see higher levels of estrogen. And we'll come back and look at that whole crazy map of this. Okay, so then this primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle, right? And really only a few of that kind of batch that have kind of risen up and are developing are going to make it to secondary follicle status, right? Because we don't want to like grow a ton of them and then waste them all. So you may have quite a handful, 10, a dozen primordial follicles moving towards primary follicles, but usually you only have a few that become this secondary follicle, and typically only one is going to become this mature or tertiary or Graafian follicle. 3 different names for the same thing. And so we're becoming this mature follicle between days 10 and 14. Remember, 14 is when this ovulation is going to occur. So we have a few days to make this final push towards follicle maturity. The tertiary follicle, the mature follicle, is going to actually bulge and distort the surface of the ovary. And at this point, right as we're getting ready to be released, that oocyte is actually going to undergo or finish meiosis 1, right? Remember, before birth, we were paused in meiosis 1. It's really just before ovulation that we'll see the completion of meiosis 1, right? So notice now they're calling it a secondary oocyte, right? Remember that secondary oocyte finished meiosis 1. It's haploid now. Okay. And so this is going to be released from the ovary. And again, the fimbriae on the ends of those uterine tubes are trying to pull that in, hoping to introduce it to sperm. Ovulation, this rupture of the actual follicle that moved to the surface, is really triggered by the hormone, luteinizing hormone. Hopefully you remember that one. And so we've got a lot of hormone activity going on here. Notice what's happening then after ovulation. And this is wild. Okay, you've had this whole group of cells that's been like working towards supporting the development of this oocyte, and now it's going to take on this totally different role, right? And it becomes what's called the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow, and so it kind of has this yellowish appearance in the ovary. The big thing here is that it's producing progesterone. So the corpus luteum producing progesterone, this is really considered the hormone of pregnancy. So progesterone is going to have major effects on the uterus, and in a way that is making it supportive of maintaining pregnancy. And if pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum is going to hold on and keep producing progesterone. If pregnancy doesn't occur, right, if fertilization doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum actually devolves into what's called the corpus albicans. Albicans, like albino, it's white. At that point, it's scar tissue. It's no longer this endocrine organ. It's just fibroblasts move in, it becomes scar tissue, and that ends the luteal phase, and so menstruation occurs, right? And we move back to the follicular phase. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Sorry, so we were seeing this in lab, right? I think all of us got a pretty good view of changes in the follicles. And again, you don't have to be able to identify, oh, is that a primary, is that a secondary? At this point, just noticing that that's a follicle, that's indicative of an ovary is good. Isn't this a crazy picture, right? Actually showing ovulation, right? This follicle just swelling, pushing out of the surface of the ovary, and then it's going to rupture. Okay, so this is what I want to look at. Actually, let's go here. So we were talking a little bit about the uterus. Again, from lab, we talked about the myometrium, this muscular, more outer region of the uterus. And of course, this is going to be important. We need smooth muscle to push a baby out of the uterus, right, for labor. And then the endometrium is going to be the portion that's actually going to be supporting the pregnancy, right? So in the endometrium, we see all these glands. If a fertilized egg touches down, it's these glands that are going to nourish it and support it until the placenta is formed. Okay, and so here they're showing kind of cartoon version endometrium versus myometrium. So the important thing that they're pointing out here, let's see if they have, yep, this artery that enters the endometrium, it's called the spiral artery. So when that constricts and cuts off the blood supply here to the endometrium, that is what's going to trigger menstruation. We decrease the blood flow to the functional zone of the endometrium, right? And that is going to cause it basically to die and be shed. And that's menstruation. So let's look at, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about how this changes, right? Because this is kind of wild to think, okay, we're losing this whole set of tissue at the beginning of each cycle, right? And then by the time the cycle ends, it has been built back up, and we're going to lose it again, right? Unless pregnancy occurs. So we'll come back and talk about this more. But I think if we put this in context of all these changes that are happening together, this looks really wild, but if you spend some time with it, I think you'll find you can wrap your head around it. So here's what we're looking at. So in this table, and your book has a similar graph, but notice what's going on here. So in this table, we're starting out by looking at the gonadotropins, right? So endocrine system. Remember, we have gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and then we have here in blue follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in pink. So the way that we always kind of set this, remember, is day 0 is when menstruation occurs, right? Day 14, right in the center here, is when ovulation occurs, right? And then we finish up the cycle, day 28, 0, right? We're right back to the start of this cycle. So what we're going to see is in the brain, so in the hypothalamus and then the pituitary, we're going to have changing levels of hormones. And what we want to do is look at how that influences the follicle. And the follicle, in response to those brain hormones is going to produce its own hormones, right? So we see things like estrogen levels rising. And then these hormones, the ovarian hormones, are going to have an influence on the uterine lining. So we kind of have these two simultaneous an ovarian cycle, right? So what's going on at the ovary, follicle development, corpus luteum, corpus albicans, and then what's going on at the uterus, the uterine cycle, menstruation, the proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and back. So let's start here with these gonadotropins. So one of the things I think that's hardest about picturing this is, so remember gonadotropin releasing hormone, this is released from the hypothalamus. This is one of those ones where it's actually the frequency of release that's changing the stimulus, right? And so I think of this as like if you're sitting there listening to the radio, what comes in on frequency 94.1 is very different than what comes in on 102.7 or right? Like one's a hard rock station and one's country music, okay? And it's just a different frequency. And so you're getting a very different message. Makes sense? So what we'll see happening is that during the follicular phase, that gonadotropin releasing hormone is being released from the hypothalamus, a pulse every 60 to 90 minutes. Okay, so just a little pulse of gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? And that's going to play a role on how we release things like follicle stimulating hormone. So at that low, every 60 to 90 minutes, at that frequency, what that's telling the pituitary is to release follicle stimulating hormone, right? And you can see follicle stimulating hormone never reaches particularly high levels, but its highest really is here during this follicular phase. And so follicle stimulating hormone, just like the name would suggest, is pushing follicle development in the ovary, right? And so as the follicle is enlarging, remember those granulosa cells, those thecal cells are causing an increase in estrogens. And so you see the estrogens rising on this ovarian hormone panel, okay? They also, the developing follicle is also going to release inhibin. So you see that rising as well. Both of those are going to have feedback on follicle stimulating hormone and gonadotropin releasing hormone. So as this estrogen level rises, you get feedback to the hypothalamus, right? And so with higher estrogen levels, the gonadotropin releasing hormone frequency is going to increase. So now it's every 30 to 60 minutes. I know that doesn't sound like a huge difference, right? It was every 60 to 90 minutes. Now it's every 30 to 60 minutes, right? But we picked up the pace. We're on a different station. And that station, that frequency of gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to tell us to increase luteinizing hormone. And so you see this big pink spike here, right? So this surge in luteinizing hormone due to the faster rate of gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is due to the increased rate of estrogens, which is, right? You get the idea. Okay, so luteinizing hormone surges and that triggers ovulation. Boom, right? Once ovulation has taken place, right, remember the follicle now becomes the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is responsible for progesterone release. And so you see this massive change in the luteal phase of this cycle, right? We were in the follicular phase, now we're in the luteal phase. Corpus luteum is cranking out progesterone, right? You see estrogen levels kind of start to drop, gonadotropin releasing hormone drops. You get down to like a pulse a day, right? Very low levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone. Just trying to figure out what my note meant. Sorry. Low levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone, high levels of progesterone, right? And the corpus luteum is hanging out. Okay. If fertilization occurs, we maintain the corpus luteum, right? We maintain progesterone levels, but if that doesn't happen, it's going to atrophy into the corpus albicans, and there you see its endocrine function just dropping off, right? Then without that progesterone, we can start upping the pulse rate of GnRH again, and the cycle starts over. Okay, jump down to what's going on here at the uterus, right? And notice day 14, right, is still where ovulation was. And so our phases are a little different, but basically here in the first half of the cycle, we spend maybe a week in menses, right, during menstruation. And then we enter what's called the proliferative phase. Following ovulation, we enter this secretory phase. So again, for menstruation to take place, we kind of pinched off the arteries, right? And we lose that whole lining, right? The functional zone of the endometrium is shed. And so in the proliferative phase, we're going to start over. And so what we see happening is this coincides with the estrogen release coming from that developing follicle. So estrogen is what's driving this proliferative phase. And basically what happens here is we're going to repair, right? So we respread kind of those epithelial cells over the endometrial surface, right? So we're kind of restoring the epithelium there, and we start to get growth and revascularization, right? Getting the blood vessels back in there to restore that functional zone, right? So we're repairing and regenerating. Okay. After ovulation, what we're going to see happen again is this now a dominance of progesterone, and progesterone is what's going to drive the secretory phase, right? Some role of estrogen, but most of it's progesterone, again, from the corpus luteum. So during the secretory phase, these uterine glands enlarge. Remember, these glands, they're producing this glycogen-rich mucus. This is meant to support an embryo that might implant here. The arteries start to enlarge. We're really trying to feed this functional zone, right? The uterus has its fingers crossed that it's going to get an embryo. And so at the end of the month, then either fertilization has taken place and we're going to maintain progesterone, we're going to maintain this lining of the uterus, or we've not gotten fertilization, hormones drop off, and we return to menstruation, right? So totally complicated. Look at these hormones going all over the place, right? And so I think that's a really good lesson for us, is that this really is a complex, amazing cycle in our bodies. And so a couple thoughts there. One, I think we should probably be more cognizant of what a lot of the hormonal contraceptives do to this mean to this cycle, how it changes this cycle. And then also we should probably be a little bit nicer to ourselves. Like if you get PMS, like there's a reason, right? Like hormones are going all over the place here, right? And these hormone changes are absolutely real. Oh, this is really interesting too. Do you see that body temperature changes as well? And this is not a dramatic change, right? This is in Celsius 36.4 to 36.7. And so it is possible, if you take your temperature right when you wake up first thing, to actually map this and have a really good idea of when ovulation is taking place. That can be used fairly successfully, barring any other, infertility issues, to kind of signal when ovulation has taken place. If you're trying to get pregnant, it can be used fairly successfully as well for preventing pregnancy. If you know that sperm can hang out in the reproductive tract for about a week, as long as you give yourself a window on either side of ovulation there. But you have to be really careful, right? You have to be on it. This is not like, oh, I forgot to take my temperature before I came to class. This is like, you got to be on it until you really learn what your body's doing. So anyway, okay. So all of these hormones, I'm including this picture because some of you may want it. It's showing the same hormones, but I think it does a nice job of showing like what is being stimulated, and those are the red arrows, and then what's being inhibited, like what's the feedback mechanism, and you see kind of these dead ends taking place there, right? And again, all of this is run on negative feedback. Okay, last thing I want to mention, right, is of course the uterus is where we house the developing fetus, but the female reproductive tract is also set up to take care of the baby once it's born. And so the mammary glands are part of this system. They are a specialized integumentary organ that's controlled basically by the reproductive system and the placenta. And so what happens here is typically what we think of as like breast material is mostly adipose, right? But you have these glands, they're just not active until the hormones of the reproductive tract and of the baby start signaling that milk production is going to be needed. And so really the glands start to develop and enlarge during pregnancy. Remember prolactin, remember oxytocin, the role those guys played. And so the mammary tissue is going to enlarge in preparation to feed the baby. Okay. And again, these all are connected. We're affecting other systems. Okay, we made it. Again, I really wish we were getting to the next chapter. Some really cool stuff as far as development goes, the formation of a placenta, those sorts of things. But we got through the male and female reproductive tracts. I hope, thinking about this a little bit more shows you how many similarities there are and then what these slight differences are. Hopefully we can appreciate that for what it is. All right, I will see you guys in lab.